So, the big question that came out of our listserv that we're here to answer is how do we measure narrative change? And this is the big question that lots of people are thinking about. And we're so excited to have this conversation today. As a member of the RadComs leadership team, I am really dedicated to thinking about how to bring researchers who are values aligned into the network and to serve movements who are working to advance leftist politics. And I'm so excited to have brought together my friends and experts who are doing this work. These are values aligned experts, and we have put together a framework for you that we think will be really helpful. It's a big framework. If you're someone who's read a lot about how to measure narrative change, this is going to feel familiar. If you are just starting, this is going to be a good place for you to start. And we'll have lots of resources to share with you. And we're building off of really great work that's already happening from ORS Impact, from Pop Culture Collaborative, people in our network like Narrative Initiative, and Brett Davidson. But we're also bringing our expertise as radical social scientists. So all of us have dedicated our lives to studying how to drive social change and using research as a tool to do that. And we've all worked as evaluators in some form. And we're also practitioners. So none of us work in academia. We're all working on the ground to create culture change, systems change, to advance just liberatory future. And we all do it across different fields. Some of us work in public health. Some of us work to transform government public systems. Some of us are working within social movements, and some of us work in pop culture. And so we bring different lenses to this work, which is exciting because what we've then been able to put together is a really flexible framework that can be tailored to whatever work you're doing. So our goal today is for you to feel more confident in evaluating. Um, and let's mute. Okay, great, thanks. Is to feel more confident in using these tools, to demystify them, to not make them feel so scary because they're not, and to democratize them so everyone feels like they can do this. And we really want you to feel like you have the power to be able to tell the story of your contribution and your impact to this work. So before we jump in, each of us are going to say one or two sentences about ourselves, and then we'll get started. But before we do that, why don't we get to know you all? Drop your name and the issue you work on, or something you care a lot about, and where you're located into the chat, just so we could get a sense of who you all are and where you all are. So awesome. We're all over the place. We're outside the US. We're all over the world. Some of you are down the street from me, which is really cool. I saw someone in Ventura. That's where I'm located. Great. So awesome. Oh, hi. So cool. Great. Well, I'm Annie Neimand. I'm based in, I always say Los Angeles, but I'm really in Ventura County, close to Ventura. And I am so excited to be here because I am passionate about using research to drive progressive leftist social change. And I will pass it to my colleague, David. Why don't you go next?
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling in from. It's awesome that we have such a wide network. My name is David Hanson, he, him pronouns. I'm a director of evaluation and social equity at a small consulting firm called Impacts. I'm Trinidadian born, but Pennsylvania based, so I feel very proud about that. And what I'm excited about mostly with measurement is the use of culturally responsive and equitable evaluation principles and practices, a hard emphasis on the culture, really bringing that into anything that we do. And I'm going to popcorn it to Melody.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, David. I'm Melody Mohebi. I help organizations design social change strategies and evaluate their efforts. Spent about the past decade working in impact entertainment. And before that, I was studying social movements and civil society. And I'm really excited to be sharing what we've been working on with you all and hearing your thoughts and passing it over to Emily.
Hi, all. Yeah, echoing the hellos and the gratitude for how many folks have joined us this morning or afternoon. My name is Emily Melnick. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, with it seems like a lot of you in the chat. So, hello, neighbors. My work is focused on public health and government social service programs. And I'm also a dramaturg and a director in my other life. And so I think about how storytelling and the arts are a force for social change, both in, as themselves and also in the public health space as well. Yewande, have you gone yet?
Nope, nope, nope. Thank you for tapping me in. Greetings and salutations. My name is Yewande Addie. I'm a narrative change researcher at RTI within RTI's Transformative Research Unit for Equity, also known as TRUE. I have a background in health communications, and my research interests revolve around identity, culture, and health equity messaging. I'm always really, really excited about studying storytelling and narrative messages as an intervention modality. So, really excited to be here with you all today.
Great. It's awesome that everyone is here, everyone is present. I really love that on a Friday. So we have this chat, this waterfall sort of like prompt. We sort of want to hear where you are at in terms of your measurement journey. So when you think about measurement, what are the one or two words that come to mind for you? And you could sort of just add in into the chat, and just put it down and we'd like take note of it. I would start with me sort of modeling behavior. When I think about measurement, I think of culture and I think of flexibility. So if you can start putting things into the chat about things come to mind, emotions, thoughts, ideas, curiosities related to measurement. Seeing a lot of reach, impact, change, tools, data crunching, learning, define goals, pulse, art, not science. Love that. Great. You guys could keep dropping into the chat. That's awesome. Um, just really want to acknowledge the range of emotions and thoughts, curiosities. Some people think a certain way, hence, maybe they have a particular calling to quantitative. Other folks, there's a particular calling to qualitative or mixed methods. This is all great. All great responses means that we're in the right place at the right time currently. Just want to also acknowledge, when we say, what things are you thinking about in terms of measurement, understanding that, thinking far back of like, when was the last time something changed your mind? What was that like? What did that lead into? Those are the sort of thoughts, and we sort of really want to welcome all of that into the space. And I know there were questions around like, why do you want to change hearts and minds in your narrative change work? Is there research someone could point me to on these topics? So these are the type of curiosities and questions that we think, being part of this presentation today would be really insightful. For those who have a lot of knowledge, we still welcome you. Maybe there's something you pick up along the way that, oh, wow, I could use that to refine my own measurement approach. And I really think that's awesome. So just moving on really quickly, get to the next question of how can we tell if we are making a difference? What we're saying is like, what specific purpose will the evaluation process serve? Understanding fully well that you cannot measure everything, so make what you measure matter. And that is sort of where we get into your values and your guiding principles, some of your organizational history. What reality do we sit in social change is that it is a very complex, nearly impossible to attribute change in any one organization or campaign. Most organizations have limited resources and time and capacity. So again, going back to that, making what you measure matter, all of those factors factor into why we think this particular workshop today is going to be very insightful. But the reality is, again, we can't measure everything. So we would like to offer a very high-level roadmap and introductory principles to demystify the measurement process to get you started along your way. What we'll cover today is narrative change landscape. This is what it is and what it is framed as, or how we view this narrative change landscape. And then we're getting to exploring that roadmap. Okay, what are some of these tools, indicators that you can use to really start mapping and understanding your particular change, your particular slice of the pie, so to speak. Then get into some guiding principles that we use and we think are very important to really understand and frame your measurement practice. And then throughout, we name entry points for you to think about, how could I be radical in this space? How could I ensure my creativity, my culture comes out in the action of measuring change? What we hope you'll get from this, and Annie sort of already mentioned this to you, just a basic understanding of the measurement principles as it relates to measurement practice and narrative change, feelings of empowerment to create dangerously. What we mean by that is like, using your own radical approaches to measure change. One size does not fit all. We all have our special source, whether that's culture, place, heritage, organizational history, that should be used in the measurement practice, should not feel afraid to do that. Particularly important to ensuring that, obviously the voice of social justice and activism, but the importance of cultural diversity and representation of the arts and any sort of narratives that you are currently looking at or exploring. And then start to develop a sense of community with others. I know it's a short time, but maybe take a look at some of the folks that are here to say, oh wow, I could collaborate with this person, or I like how that person thinks. Let me grab a coffee with them. The idea is to really get that sense of community to ensure that learning doesn't stay within one particular organization, but it transcends throughout other organizations and movements as well. And now I transition to Annie to talk a little bit more about that narrative change landscape.
Great, thanks so much. So this might be a little bit of a 101 reminder overview, but we wanted to ground this work in a shared understanding of the narrative change landscape. So we have a shared definition that we're working from. This is our perspective on it. It certainly isn't the only perspective, and we're not the first people to say it. This aligns very much with what we've seen come out of other organizations. I know that the narrative curriculum that Radcoms is working on is rooting it in this narrative change landscape framework. I believe Narrative Initiative also talks about this narrative landscape. And so we're not the first to say it, but this is sort of the framing that we're using. And so some definitions. This definition of narrative comes from Narrative Initiative. Narratives are the ideas and themes that permeate collections of stories. The ideas can appear in any structure and are articulated and refined repeatedly in a variety of stories and messages. I like to think of narratives as a collection of stories. They are stories told over and over and over again until they become overarching narratives. And when those narratives permeate culture, they become deep narratives and our worldviews, and we believe them to be true in fact. And we forget that they're actually constructed and maintain sort of our social norms and our values, and that they can be changed. And we can also think about like frames and messages. And those are sort of like the way those things help us. Those things frame how we should think about issues. So they define the problem and the solution, and it directs people to look at it directs people on how to interpret certain things that they're witnessing. And so for us, in this room, all of us are here because we do some sort of narrative change. And I was talking to my really great friend, Samantha Wright, who you all may know. She was at Participant. She worked with Melody. Then she was at Exposure Labs. Before that, she works a lot in the climate change and storytelling space. And she was telling me that, everyone in the field is doing narrative change, but they're not all doing the same thing. It's like there's these three people named narrative, and they're not the same person. And I really liked that framing, and it really helped me start to think about the landscape. And so that's what we're offering here. And as I talk through these, I encourage you to think about what's your narrative orientation? Where do you situate yourself in the narrative landscape? And it might not just be one of these buckets, it might be across buckets. You might do a little bit of all of it, but just in the purpose of thinking about like, okay, what is my narrative orientation? Therefore, what do I measure in terms of impact? It's helpful to look at each individually, but in real life, everything's messy, of course. So first, you might think of narrative as art and entertainment. So these are folks who produce art, music, films, individual stories as a way to change narrative. These are individual pieces that are contributing to a larger shift in the stories being told. Then we have narrative as strategic communications. These are people who might be working on campaigns over a very specific period of time. These are people who are maybe thinking about messages and doing message testing and then creating a campaign from that and thinking about the stories that could be told in order to get that message out to a particular audience, in order to make a particular action happen. And then there is narrative as organizing or power building. And we see this as using narrative as part of a social movement, grassroots social movement strategy. And this is organizing with people who are the closest to oppression, people who are the ones who are living the issues that we are working to transform, and building power among them and shifting narrative by building power behind their voice and their stories. And in doing that, it shifts narratives. In reality, you might be doing all of them or a couple of them, but we want to give you some examples of what these look like. So for example, if we're thinking about narrative as art, here's an example that's kind of two examples in one, which is always nice when you're doing a presentation. So on the left side, we have the Rehabilitation Through the Arts program, which took place in the 90s at the Sing Sing Correctional Facility in New York. And this was a program that brought together the prison population to craft a play about their experiences and their lives as a way to foster rehabilitation. And in doing that, they found that it created positive changes in their lives. So that's an example of using the arts as a way for people to tell their individual stories to change something for them. At the same time, we recently saw a singular film, Sing Sing, about that exact program, which is another example of narrative as art or narrative as entertainment, where there's a singular film that's an intervention in that it's providing us a different story about the incarcerated population that is different from the dominant story that we get about people who have that experience.
I'll pop in. So as an example of narrative as strategic comms, I'd like to share some work from my team at RTI. Last year, we completed and debuted a 30-minute documentary film called Heart, Serving Our Neighbors in Crisis. HEART actually stands for the Holistic Empathetic Assistance Response Team, and it's an alternative crisis response organization that's based in Durham, North Carolina. They are completely staffed by a peer network, as well as mental health clinicians that work alongside fire, police, and EMS, which is very rare. And so the existence of the HEART program in our documentary sort of functions as a response to movement building narratives around defunding the police. And we did that by showcasing a compassionate model of what reallocating resources could actually look like. Our story is also framed by RTI research on 911 call data, which showed that less than 2% of calls were for violent crimes. And this finding alone sort of implies that there were gaps in mental health and social welfare needs that superseded what the police are typically equipped to do. And rather than simply sharing those results in executive summary or report, we opted to use film to assemble all these sort of community stories and strategically share them in a creative format. So that's one example. Next slide. The next example is the Black Student Storytelling Project, and it represents narrative organizing within a university context. So the purpose of the project was all about gathering personal narratives from Black students about their experience at a predominantly white institution, or PWI, in the year after George Floyd's murder. It makes me really, really happy to see this screenshot because since all of the sort of statewide brouhaha over DEI, the site as it was is no longer available. However, leading this project really felt like a radical approach to research and storytelling because we were able to really depart from the conventional model of having students study from an outsider perspective. Instead, the goal was about putting the power in the hands of students themselves to tell their own stories. We also built a mini production team to make audio packages using selected stories that we have permission to use, and created a digital archived collection so that these stories sort of live in perpetuity, even if the website didn't. This particular slide features a quote from one of the participants who happened to be an international student from Ghana. So just allow me to quickly paraphrase it. He said, "I wanted to buy some clothes and I saw a Black hoodie, very, very beautiful, but I couldn't buy it because I felt that if I'm to wear this in the evening and I'm walking around a neighborhood, somebody could call the cops on me and I could be arrested. I could be killed or someone can just shoot me." That was probably the most difficult time of my life. I planned to start jogging in the evening because the weather is quite fine for exercise, but I couldn't because I was afraid. And when I think about this particular quote, I think about that tension and confrontation of race, racism, and racial identity, and what it means to be Black and African during such a socially tense time while coming from a predominantly Black country. And so this project was able to invite the complexity of that experience, um, while also having a way of building community through narrative power. Oh, Annie, you're muted.
Of course. Such a powerful example of narrative organizing and power building. Another example that might be familiar, that comes from movement work, that I came across in the Practical Radicals podcast, is the United We Dream movement led by Christina Jimenez. And she describes this work as narrative power building because they did not have consultants that created a communication strategy for them. It was young people talking about the injustices that they experienced and what they dreamed for undocumented people and what it would feel like to be unafraid. And their narrative strategy was rooted in their experiences, their stories, and painting the picture of the world that they wish existed. And so this is another example of what narrative organizing looks like compared to narrative as art, narrative as strategic communications, narrative as organizing.
And one final example from participant media, where I was previously, was kind of sometimes you have a mix. So you might have a piece of art and a strategic communications plan. So for example, Dark Waters was a narrative feature film, and it was accompanied by the Fight Forever Chemicals Impact campaign. The film had its own theatrical audience and was an opportunity to raise the profile of Forever Chemicals among the audiences and kind of press about the film. And the campaign partnered with activists working on the ground at the local and state level to address legal and corporate policies.
So I'm curious to just drop in the chat, where do you think your work falls? We would love to know. Narrative is art, narrative is strat comms, narrative is as organizing, all of it, something different. What do you all think? All of the above, stratcom, power building, all three. And that's good to know it's all three, because here's the next chapter in this story. Depending on what your orientation is, you're going to measure different things. And so it's important to know that, so you know whether it's the piece of art, it's the campaign, or it's the organizing. That's going to help you determine what the indicators are that you should be looking at. So now that you've located yourself in the narrative landscape and you have a sense of your piece of the pie, your contribution to larger narrative change, I can't see what I have here. Let's see. Your approach will shape your theory of change, so how you think change happens, and therefore what you measure. But before you do any of that, all of us have to do a narrative power analysis. And if you have never done a narrative power analysis before, a narrative power analysis is a method to examine the underlying narratives that shape the cultural norms and institutions that uphold oppression, power, and maintain the status quo. And then by breaking down these narratives into the pieces, such as characters, conflicts, assumptions, it helps us know the weaknesses and contradictions that we can target with our work in order to promote an alternative radical future. And we got this from the Beautiful Trouble toolkit. And this is also something that we are building our narrative power curriculum around as well. But all of us need to know what are the existing narratives around the issues that we're working on in order to know what are we changing? What are we working to transform? And so you want to start with a narrative power analysis. And then after you do that, then you think about, okay, how am I going to change it? Am I going to make a piece of art? Am I going to do a campaign? Am I going to organize people? And then depending on what you're doing, what you need to measure is going to look different. If I am doing narrative organizing, I also need to think about measuring, am I building collective identity? Am I building strong relationships? How many voices are present that were not present before versus art as our narrative as entertainment, where it's much more about how many people are coming to this screening and talking about this piece of art, how many people connected with the characters and experienced narrative transportation. And we'll get into all of that. But it's important to locate yourself so you have a more clear vision of the things that you actually need to keep track of to be able to talk about your contribution to change.
And building off the work done in the narrative power analysis phase, once you understand more about the narrative landscape, it creates opportunities to decide what kind of narrative change you're looking to make. And that idea is summed up really well in this quote from ORS Impact. It says, the function you expect your narrative to play has an important implications for what you end up measuring. It also has implications on your narrative change approach. And ORS Impact actually suggests a couple of different options. Next slide. If you're working in an area that's suffering from a lack of stories or an anchoring narrative, you can create a new one. This might mean that measuring how that new narrative shows up in media or among particular constituencies would be a meaningful approach to measurement. You might decide that you want to develop a counter narrative to work against an existing harmful one. In that instance, it may be more useful to look at changes over time in how that issue is being discussed. But whatever the narrative change choice you make, there's several here, you want to make sure that it aligns with the intention of your work and the indicators that you'll actually be tracking. So ultimately, a good sort of reflection question here is, did we execute our narrative change choice? Did the new narrative you introduced catch fire? Were you able to successfully reframe an existing narrative? Again, it's really good to be clear here because what you might track for an original narrative is going to look different compared to maybe if you're looking at indicators for amplifying an existing narrative. So be conscious of your narrative change choice because it's going to inform what and how you measure.
I'll continue the theme of being conscious of your goals as a way to think about what and how you're measuring your narrative change work. we talk a lot about theory of change as a really critical tool for measurement. And here in narrative change work, the theory of change is especially important given how complex narrative change work can be. Your theory of change is a guiding framework. It helps you articulate your goals, helps you get clear on what you believe will help achieve those goals. And the theory of change should not only kind of clearly articulate the type of narrative change you plan to engage, just as Yewande shared about some of those narrative change choices, but also the why behind your narrative change choice overall. So as you can imagine, all of you are coming in from different vantage points, and you enter into narrative change work with different kinds of goals. It might be to ultimately change narratives so you can change policies and laws. It might be to change narratives so you can change the way that communities or individuals relate to each other on a day-to-day basis. It could be around changing attitudes and interpersonal behaviors. It could be that ultimately you want to change narratives so you can seek funding or other types of support for services or work, or to spur some sort of collective action or advocacy. And so that set of your ultimate goals, what you ultimately want to see at the end of your narrative change work or through your narrative change work, should really inform not only your narrative change choices and activities, but how you think about measuring whether your work was successful and what you need in that vein. So whatever the case may be, your theory of change will really ground you in those goals, right? And serve as a guidepost for both of those things. So the thing I'll say about about a theory of change framework is, before we get into the what, is I find it to be an opportunity for radical inclusion and imagination at the start of your work. It is not only an opportunity to use like a formal evaluation framework, but it's an opportunity to bring in stakeholders, partners, other communities, folks that are connected to this work, who will be affected by this work, to begin to ensure you have a shared understanding of where you're going, whether where you're going is appropriate and worthwhile. It's a way to bring communities together to radically imagine futures that are imbued with a lot of different possibilities. And it's a way to bring communities together to ensure that the road that you're on is going to minimize harm or potential harms to various folks who are involved in your work. And so not only is a theory of change a really important evaluation tool, I find it to be the first step on a radical social change activity journey. And so it's really important for both of those reasons. So what is this theory of change framework? In its most simple form, it is an if-then statement. It's a logical statement. It predicts how what we do in a project will affect the world. So a theory of change goes, if we do X, then Y will occur. And so ultimately Z will be achieved. You can go to the next slide. So just diving in on what those variables are. When we say if we do X, what that X is referring to is all of the inputs and activities and outputs that go with narrative change practice. So inputs include all the resources that we're putting into this work, whether it's staffing, materials, partnerships, what have you. Activities are literally the things on your to-do list, the things that go into your project plan, what you and your teams and your collaborators are literally going to do. And the outputs are kind of a quantification of that, what you expect to see at the end of the day. The why is those short and medium term outcomes. That is all of the things that you might begin to see as results of your work. And that could be changes in knowledge, that could be views of a certain piece of media, that could be changes in behaviors. A whole range of things can go on that why. And Z is your ultimate impact. That's where your goals really lie, both questions around, did we create a new narrative? Did we amplify an existing narrative? And did we achieve some of our longer term impact goals around, was funding increased for this work? Was new legislation passed? Things like that. That all goes in the Z. So your theory of change then becomes, just as you are working, and you can go to slide 24. I just skipped ahead in my notes. It's really important to think through how you're consistently tracking your contribution to that ultimate impact. But as much as a theory of change can be a great way to measure how you're contributing to ultimate impact, we know that all of this work exists in a huge, vastly complex context of other actors, other laws, other contingencies, all of that complexity that we are all working in every day. And so many people come to this work of how do I measure narrative change with a hunger to say, how do I prove that this campaign or this activity caused this outcome? Or maybe more accurately, my funders want me to prove that our work and our work alone caused this outcome. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that is not the most radical or realistic approach to measuring narrative change. You definitely want to be able to talk about how your work and see how your work is contributing to the larger conversation around narratives, but thinking about our work as contributions, as a set of voices among many, as opposed to being able to say this and only this caused XYZ outcome. So that's that for that slide. I do want to go to slide 25, which is, related to that point. The theory of change that we just described is a very tight and a very simplified way of articulating all of the elements that go into narrative change or social impact project. And so, just to reiterate again, what's not included in that X, Y, then Z is all of the other externalities. And so as you're developing your theory of change, it's really important to write down the assumptions and take note of the context in which you're working, what you think will contribute to your narrative change work. But the simplified distillation of if X, then Y, then Z is a really great starting point from which you can begin to build both a strategy plan and a measurement plan. So we can go to slide 26, where your simple theory of change can be really helpful is it does kind of allow you to take this very abstract concept of how do we seed progress and turn it pretty rapidly into, as I said, a measurement plan. So if you've listed out your Z, you can begin to say, if our ultimate impact is these Z things, what are the ways that we want to talk through measuring that? What are the things that I want to look for? I said some examples. It might be a change in funding. It might be a change in legislation. It might be just the number of folks who are engaged in conversation. It could be a lot of things. What's your Z? Put together some measures there. And then working backwards, if this is our Z, our ultimate impact, what are the outcomes that we are looking for in the next 6 months to 2 years to help us see, like, are we on our way, right? So that's your why. How will you measure your why? It could look like anything from page views to numbers of conversations to attitudes to knowledge. That will look different depending on your specific narrative change goals. And that's a little bit beyond the scope of this conversation, but that's what goes in the outcomes, the why column. And then you can work backwards from there to what's perhaps the easiest and simplest part of the work to fill in. What is the X? What are the things that need to be in our to-do list today, this year, tomorrow? And what are the inputs? What are the amounts of funding? What are the partnerships, other pieces that we need to make sure are in place? And I will say this as a recovering grant writer, a log frame is a really, really helpful way to go from an abstract, inclusive, radical conversation about meaningful change to a concrete grant proposal that can be used to share with funders, both in the private and the public space, in a language that, frankly, they will understand. And I'll pause there before I go too rogue.
All right, so in this section, I'm going to actually build off of what Emily said, and Yewande and I were going to walk through some recommended indicators and research methodologies that you can use to make your roadmap into an actionable framework. Obviously, these are not exhaustive, but they can hopefully serve as a helpful starting point. So most of your measurement work will fall into these 4 categories of indicators that you'll want to consider tracking and evaluating. I'm going to go through each of them in the following slides, first showing how they layer into the log frame, and then go deeper into typical indicators and methodologies. So first, this is about the message and messenger. Here you're checking if your message and messengers align with your theory of change, and considering if and how your stories and message are in service of shifting narratives. Then you want to look at reach, whether you reach the community you intended to and how it's integrating principles of equity. And so these 2 buckets are your activities or outputs. Next is the people category. I did see a nod to this in the chat, and this is where you're going to spend most of your measurement capacity to assess cultural changes as a result of your intervention. And these are your short, medium, and long-term outcomes. And finally, you want your work to be part of this, bigger cultural and structural changes, which on the log frame is the impact. Given the complexity of this change, which take place over a longer period of time and is affected by broader sociopolitical contexts, most organizations will not be in a position to measure impact on a regular basis. In this case, you can rely on outside organizations, either within or outside of academia, that assess shifts across issue areas. Now, whether you're able to do this research, or use third parties, you want to set yourself up so that you're able to determine your contribution by measuring the previous categories. Okay. So going a level deeper. So in terms of what you actually measure in the message and messenger category, we think it's helpful to consider some of the following questions and identify specific indicators related to them. First, is your messaging grounded in your theory of change? How does it challenge or reflect existing power structures? If relevant, for example, does it have a call to action? To turn the questions into indicators, look at your narrative change choices and ensure your message is aligned with your intention. So did you counter a harmful dominant narrative, or did you connect an existing narrative to your issue area? Another key bucket is around voice. And again, this is really key, is who's telling the story or sharing the message, whose voice is being centered. And your indicators are about the people telling their stories and the increase in messaging that is centering the people most affected by an issue. And third, examine if you're immersing your audience. This means looking to see if there's narrative transportation, whereby people are able to identify with the characters presented. And finally, you want to try to understand what care was taken for the storytellers. Indicators here might be around training or stipends, and again, within ethical guidelines. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Yewande, who can provide some examples on the methodologies you can use to capture these.
Thanks, Melody. So when thinking about measuring both the message and the messenger, one method you can use is message analysis. And this is going to help you see if the message itself is clear, if it's using the right tone or language, and most importantly, if it's aligned with your goals. Are people getting the core ideas you want them to? Is your messenger helping to facilitate that process, or are they a distraction? Then there's narrative transportation analysis, which looks at how emotionally invested your audience is. Are they really connecting with the story you're telling? Can they imagine themselves as being part of the narrative? Or do they share any sort of personal connections with your cast of characters? You also want to test your message directly with audiences through message testing, so you can tweak or refine your narrative before rolling it out more widely. Throughout this methodology phase, it's really important to engage in some critical self-reflection to make sure that you're doing work in an ethical way, avoiding any harm or bias. And finally, we must always remember to assess power and equity so that we're constantly auditing ourselves and taking a closer look at whether the message and the messenger are amplifying voices equitably, or whether we're actually addressing systemic issues or unintentionally reinforcing them. So these methods are all a few approaches that can help you get a clearer picture of both the content of your message and the impact of the messenger. Back to Melody for weather.
All right, thank you. So for reach, your first priority is to see if you've reached your target community. This set of indicators is typically about tracking kind of quantitative outputs, You want to check who and how many people you reach from each segment of your intended population. Then you want to see if it was at the right scale. For example, if you're trying to reach educators, did you reach a notable percentage of educators within a school district? If you're looking at local policymakers, do you know who needs to consider a new approach? And did you reach those individuals? And finally, did people actually engage, the people that you reached, they engage with your activities? So this is to show that it's not just a one-way street. So here, if you put something like, for example, on social media, did people like, share, or comment? If you had a screening, did people leave reviews? And the engagement analysis will depend on your activity and your approach.
Methods, we meet again. So if you're trying to track reach, there are a few different ways you can do that. First, reach tracking. It can help you understand how many people have come across your message. Participation tracking focuses on who's actively engaging in activities like attending events or jumping into discussions. You can also look at outreach tracking, which is how well your emails are doing by checking open rates. Press analysis can be crucial in terms of being an indicator because it can help you understand which media outlets are actually covering your message and how frequently that's happening. To make sure you're connecting with the right groups, community segmentation can help you target specific communities, while engagement tracking lets you see how these groups are interacting with your message, be it online or in person. Social media engagement helps you dive deeper into things like views or shares and comments, while action tracking goes even further by measuring what actions people are taking after the engagement. So are they signing a petition or making a donation? And these are all methods that can give you a window into how well your message is reaching and resonating with your target audience. Melody?
Right. So as mentioned, this is the section where we recommend the bulk of your work, bulk of your efforts. Here you're really looking at how you're affecting individuals and their broader communities. Kind of broke them down into 4 key questions. The first 2 around what are the shifts in knowledge, perceptions, attitudes, and beliefs, and what are the shifts in intended or actual behavior. You can capture quantifiable data such as percentages, or as we saw in some of these examples, descriptive changes from a qualitative lens. So really stories about the stories that you're telling. And then another category of questions to consider is if there is a strengthening of community around your issue. Example here might be measuring the number of groups using your resources to organize for themselves. And finally, you can assess if more stories are being shared by a broader set of storytellers as a result of your intervention. And this last one is particularly important if you're working in narrative organizing and power building.
All right, so this time we've broken methods into 3 different method types. So direct methods are your go-to tools when you want to hear directly from your audience. So things like surveys where you can quickly gather feedback, or focus groups where you get a chance to dive into more detailed conversations. You can even try arts-based methods, which are some of my favorites. This is where you have participants create something like a photo or piece of art to really capture their experience to the message or their reaction to it. These are the types of methods that are really good for understanding how your narrative is landing. Now, if you want to observe without direct interaction, then passive methods are your best bet. And this includes like participant observation, where you're simply watching how people engage with the content, or using media analytics tools like social listening to track what people are saying about your narrative online. These methods, they'll give you sort of a sense of audience behavior without interrupting your audience. And then finally, if you're looking for an outside perspective, you can partner with third-party organizations like the Norman Lear Center or Harmony Labs, or work with an independent academic researcher. And these external partners, they specialize in evaluating media impact. They also offer you data-driven insights that add an extra layer of credibility to your evaluation if that's necessary. Next slide. So now we're about to start having a discussion about scaling up measurement efforts to the cultural and structural level. And I'd like to share a quote from Dimple Abichandani that gets at that idea. She says, "If we're trying to change the ocean, why are we measuring the drops? We need to measure the ocean." And this quote serves as a reminder that while focusing on the smaller, more immediate shifts, is necessary, we also need to keep our eye on the larger long-term impacts. So if you have the resources and capacity and bandwidth, measuring that broader change will give you a clearer sense of how your narrative is influencing change on a larger scale. I want to emphasize the part about resources and capacity and bandwidth, because it's important to point out that not everyone needs to measure the full impact or the ocean right away. Instead of going straight to the Atlantic, you may want to, stick to the rivers and the lakes that you're used to, at least initially. Many of us are likely going to be focusing our resources on those smaller steps that we discussed, previously, like tracking changes in attitudes or conversations, and that's completely fine. But for those that do have the capacity to measure bigger, or measure the ocean, it's certainly valuable. Next slide. And should you decide to go culture tracking or looking at impacts at the structural level, there are a few things that you could focus on. So, what are the shifts in public discourse? This is about looking at the conversations happening in media, on social platforms, and in communities and how they're evolving. Is your narrative changing the way people talk about the issue? Are they using new language or framing it differently? You can look at changes in the private and public sector policies. Here you're tracking actual shifts in laws or regulations or company policies. Has your narrative shifted the way that decision makers are thinking? Have they adjusted their practices or adopted any new standards? Changes in norms, social norms is also a good indicator to monitor. And this is all about, sort of those unspoken rules that govern our society. So are behaviors or expectations or attitude shifting in response to your narrative? I know these are sort of like subtle changes, but they can indicate a deeper impact. And finally, are there any shifts in power dynamics? Here you want to see if the narrative is changing who holds influence. Is your message elevating marginalized voices or changing the balance of power in a particular community or industry? These are the kind of questions that can lead to answers that demonstrate how your narrative is shaping the conversation and then the actions at that scaled up level. I know now you're probably wondering, how do I do all of that? Well, next slide. This is how we do it. I know I'm sorry. It's the last methodology slide. So just hold your tomatoes. I'm being a little corny. It's Friday. Because we are measuring broader structural changes in culture, we have an equally broad list of key methodologies. So participatory action research and collective sense making, these approaches engage community directly to see how they interpret and respond to the narrative. And it's a more collaborative way to surface any sort of emerging shifts that are taking place by involving actual people that are impacted by whatever issue you're covering in that narrative within the evaluation process. Power mapping, also a great method, shows whether your narrative is altering any power dynamics. It's identifying who holds influence in the conversation, if there are any new voices that are gaining ground. Those are pieces that you'd be able to elucidate from the power mapping process. Storytelling and narrative inquiry. So this method focuses on stories that are being shared in response to the narrative. So are new stories being told, or are people reframing old ones in a particular way? This type of inquiry is really helpful at showing, any shifts in cultural values. Many of you are probably familiar with ethnography. This is more of a long-term observation approach where you can track gradual shifts in communities and specifically like behaviors or beliefs or practices that are happening in response to your narrative. Narrative policy framework, one of my faves. This framework actually evaluates if your narrative is impacting policy making and helps you track any sort of new laws or policies that reflect values and ideas that were introduced by your narrative. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip down to the outcomes harvesting. So with this method, you collect or you harvest evidence of what has changed or your outcomes, and then you work backwards to see if and how your narrative contributed to these changes. So these are just a few methodological tools you can tap to track that long-term structural change. And now I will be quiet and hand things over to David.
Thank you. Thank you. And I know some folks are still on call, which is awesome. Some folks had to hop off. We really want to honor that. I know we threw a lot at you, so you want to take time to sort of like, almost like a pre-post, a very crude pre-post to understand, okay, how are you feeling now? Are things becoming more clear? Are you connecting with folks in the chat? Are you getting more curiosities? So very quickly in the chat, could you put down what emotions come to mind when you're thinking about narrative change now? We had that first question around like, what are some measurement things come to mind? Now, what are some emotions? We would want to emphasize the emotions that come to mind as you're thinking about narrative change. So take a few seconds and just drop it in the chat pretty quickly. I'm seeing excitement, eagerness, curiosities, overwhelmed, and it's a lot. Curiosity, which I love, being overwhelmed, some discouragement. Hopefully in the chat, or the resources we provide afterwards, you'll be able to like do some digging, and that feelings of overwhelming would sort of like reduce. Think big and small, curiosities, hard, exhausted, hope, eagerness. Great. So very huge range of emotions. And I think once we're able to share this, you're able to go back and sort of like do some reading, do some further digging. My hope is, and I want to share that vibe, that you sort of get a better understanding or come to a place of better understanding, knowing fully well that this is all going to be a journey and you learn as you grow. So really want to acknowledge that. Okay, let's move on to guiding principles. So these are things that, we believe in this measurement change. That these things could sort of like guide you, could act as a real post, ensure that you are actually centered, doing the right work, and documenting that right work as you go along. So the very first principle we get to is centering those closest to the oppression and building power. And we love that, this is done in a very inclusive, respectful way, being in that right relationship with those folks who are undergoing some turmoil and trauma and some ill will, to really ensure that those are the folks who are closest to the work that you want to do, and your strategies, your activities, your outputs, all of that is really centered around those, by honoring them as well, right? So it's not just, oh, we just want to extract, but also like, hey, we want to, have you closer to the decision making, but at the same time too, we want to pay you for your time, straight up, like, paying folks for their time is very important in all of this. So a lot of collaboration, a lot of co-creation to ensure that, the measurement and construction of your desired narrative change is actually happening and tailored to those closest to the oppression and building power. And a useful tool for that could be the spectrum of engagement, for example, which looks at whether you are using the folks closest as informing, or are they sort of more embedded within decision making, and being very mindful about that. Emily?
The second principle that we want to talk about is practicing care with communities. And I think about this in two ways. One is very much building off what David was just saying around thinking about whom this work is about, and knowing that narrative change has historically come from outside practitioners saying, these are the stories we need to tell about you and y'all, and these are the stories that will help you. And as radical communicators, we are very much moving away from that. And practicing care with communities looks like being really mindful of about who you're telling stories about and ensuring that they are informing decision making, but also understanding many of us are coming from living in and embodying some of the work that we are seeking, some of the challenges that we're seeking to change through narrative change work, right? And so practicing care with communities both looks like who outside this organization needs to be included, but also who within this organization, inside in this reproductive justice organization, is dealing with the emotional fallout of this work. Who in this immigrant justice organization is dealing with the emotional fallout of this work? How do we take care of each other as narrative change practitioners? The other piece on this slide, and then I'll keep it pushing, I do want to name that especially at a nonprofit, in a narrative change activist space, we all have limitations of resources, of expertise, of minds, and sometimes it feels like taking on true social justice work requires throwing every single thing we have at it. And part of practicing care with communities is knowing, what can I do reasonably with what we have now, and how can I move this work forward? How can I evaluate responsibly, but also within my means and within the means of my organization? And so part of this work that we're starting today with this conversation is understanding, if you're not a PhD, which I am not, and have worked in this space, if you're not funded to have a dedicated evaluator, how do you, with care and with right-sized resources, just identify the simple tools that you can use as your organization to measure the things that you can measure. Because I do believe that every organization can measure their narrative change work at the level that matches their resources. David, back to you.
Yeah, sweet. Thank you for that. And then sort of latching on to that again, we recognize that no one person or organization can do it all. So it's really not about attribution. We are also contributing to, that change. And there are many different factors that could lead into some sort of change or some of your outcomes that you're looking at. So keeping that in mind, understanding it's a very complex world that you're participating in, and then with context really dictates how things look. But it's sort of getting away from the attribution to understand that we are all in this together, and it's more about a contribution. And how do you explore that more, given the fact that you are not doing it all? Your results may not always result in this big change, but understand that other folks, other organizations, other actions are sort of like leading into that change. Emily?
The next, principle is letting go of prediction and embracing surprise, especially if you're traditionally focused on kind of human services work or other work where it's like, if I put this in, I'll get that out. We know narrative change is not a vending machine, and it's okay to embrace that and use that flexibility in the way that you think about what the work is, and not consider surprise or changes to be marks of failures, but marks of opportunities and learnings.
In light of opportunities, use emergent learning principles and practices. What this means is taking time to reflect. How are we doing? How are we working together? What are we learning particularly about this, initiative, this program, this activity, and use that to really tailor your future decision making. You don't need to wait until the end to do it. You could do a mid-action review, for example, but just really try to ensure that you have a learning organization or learning mindset. We are constantly looking at what could we do better? What are we doing really well? What could we sort of like need to stop doing? I think those are really some good ideas of how to ensure that learning becomes a habit within the organization rather than something we just do when something is wrong. So based on emergent learning principles, I think, making things visible, sort of naming those things that are, hey, we are really struggling with this, or this is what we're doing well, should be definitely a common practice. Asking some powerful and critical questions, related to power and equity. Are we being radical in our approaches? Are we ensuring that all voices are being heard? Are we ensuring that the power is equally distributed? Is there a history of this sort of misdistribution of power? How do we change that? Those are things that, ensures that you're learning and you're ensuring that learning becomes a common practice within your organization or your movement. And then finally, holding space for experimentation and curiosities. A lot of folks mentioned that they were very curious about this process. Keep that, right? That is a power, that is a superpower you could use throughout the entire measurement practice.
I actually just I glanced in the chat and saw exactly my point, and so I'll just lift it up, Manon, in that spirit. Sharing what you learn is really important, and often there's trepidation to share what didn't work. And exactly as this comment says, funders often really appreciate learning from stuff that doesn't turn out as you hoped. Sharing the lessons that are learned the hard way is really, really important, both in your formal kind of reports and funder engagement, things like that, but also informally and with each other. Find someone to have a monthly coffee chat with and, shoot the breeze and share all of your trials and tribulations. This chat is an incredible resource. I am hungry for all of the things that I'm seeing in this chat. And so just really being actively engaged in not gatekeeping what we know. We're all working on different parts of the puzzle, but we're very much all in this together. And I'm so sorry to do a High School Musical reference on this, the last day of the week, but it's true. And we really do need to work in collaboration with each other.
Well, it wouldn't be radical if there wasn't some sharing and caring going on. So, in closing, we wanted to cap this session off by sharing a few resources that helped inform the session. They might also, provide some really helpful information for you. The first one is the ORS Impacts Measuring Narrative Change Report. It's a good practical guide for anyone that wants to learn more about tracking the influence of their stories, especially in the public opinion space and culture or in policy over time. The report even suggests and explains some qualitative and quantitative strategies for measurement. The second source here is the Deepening Engagement for Lasting Impact framework by Learning for Action. And this guide has great tips on how organizations can move beyond some of those vanity metrics like views or impressions to really sort of eke out indicators that measure quality engagement. It also has some good planning worksheets if you're interested in adapting them for your own work. I won't go through them all, but because I believe these will be shared alongside with all the great, resources that have been dropped into the chat. But I'm sure you probably noticed organizations like Narrative Initiative and the Center for Story-Based Strategy also on that list. They have a number of resources on their sites as well. And finally, our team will be, we have a forthcoming evaluation article, and we look forward to sharing that with you all soon. So, Annie?
Great. Thank you all so much. What a fun chat. And also what a fun chat in the chat space. Next, we're going to turn to some Q&A. As if you're in the RadCom listserv, you know that we had a very big conversation about this. And I sent out a Google Doc and said, drop your questions in here so we know what you all want to know. And then we can build questions around it and build a presentation around it. So we have some questions that came from the listserv. We're going to go through those. And then if we have time, we'll also go through the questions that came up in the chat. And then for those of you who are asking how to join the listserv, go to the radicalcommunicatorsnetwork.org
radcomsnetwork.org/join
and join us. And you'll be plugged into all things radical communicators. So you could drop your questions into the chat. Ariana is looking for those. And if we don't get to them today, we will find a way to hold more space for these sorts of conversations. We don't know what it will look like yet, so stay tuned, but we'll make sure that this conversation continues to go on and on and on until you're over it. So with that, I'm going to open it up to our panelists who are our presenters and start with some questions. And our first question is really about what are some creative ways to collect data? And I want to emphasize something that Emily shared. I know this can be really overwhelming because you feel like you have to do everything. Like I have to know how to do ethnography and surveys and I have to do this and this. No. What resources and capacity do you have? What can you know with those resources? And you want to fit your evaluation based off of those resources. So with that in mind, I think we can answer this question. What are some creative ways that you have collected data at events or for particular research questions that this group might experiment with in their own work? And Melody, I'll throw it to you.
Thank you. And with apologies, someone seems to be building something right above my head. So apologize for that in advance. This is great. I've worked with a lot of screenings and events and everything. And one of the things is I always want to know a lot of information. I want to know everything. How did you feel? What did you think? What did you do? What are you going to do? And
we can't hear it. Don't worry.
Oh, okay, can hear it. That's great. So I think what's really important is what is the most basic, what's the simplest thing? What's the main thing you want to know? And pick that. And I think that's really critical because when you try to ask for too much, people will just kind of be like, I participated, I'm feeling emotional and kind of like stop. So, whether it's having a really simple survey with 3 questions, put up a QR code if you want it digital. I found it's really helpful when you have paper and pen. You print things out on a piece of paper, cut it into 3 kind of pieces. It's 5 questions. 3 of them are kind of check marks from strongly agree to strongly disagree or fill it in. If you want more qualitative, you I was just at a screening event the other day where they had small cards they were passing around and you were able to write something on the back of it. So another, I think, fun thing we did one time was we wanted to know what actions people were intending to take. And we had jars and you could drop a token into whichever one that you were more likely to kind of participate in. So those are, yeah, just some examples.
Feel free to jump in, panel, if you have answers to the question of creative ways to collect data.
I haven't used this method a ton. I've supported a few others that have, but photo voice is something that comes to mind for me. Definitely suggest if you don't know that much about it, I'm not the person to explain it, but looking it up is certainly could be an enriching way to collect and share data. Seen a lot of interesting approaches to that, like through data galleries or have partnering with museums and libraries to sort of showcase some of the photo voice output in another sort of gallery approach. So, and then of course, just thinking about my experience with the Black Student Storytelling Project, anytime you have the opportunity to do some story curation or use story collection as a part of your data collection method, that's always kind of cool for me.
I'm thinking about the work that the RADCOMs did with the Center for Public Interest Communications and Millie on the Broke project. And we had a pretty small research budget. The whole grant, I think, was 100,000, and the research budget was a fraction of that. So we relied on the RADCOM network and the Center for Public Interest Communications network to help us identify organizations that work on issues related to economic justice. We just said, fill out the survey and tell us all the organizations you know that are doing this work. So then we got this big list. Then we worked with a group of students at the University of Florida to do some social listening to find out which of these groups has the loudest voice relative to their size on social media, to understand like who might be shaping the narrative in the philanthropic sector the most on issues related to economic justice. And then from there, we didn't have that much capacity to look at so many organizations. So we picked 10 as a small representative sample. And we had grassroots organizations, we had big philanthropic organizations, and we had medium nonprofit organizations. And then a group of graduate students collected stories from each of those organizations, and we analyzed the content on their websites related to economic issues using a critical race theory rubric that we found in an academic journal, but is available for you all on the Broke website for free. And we analyzed it, and then we looked at patterns across, and we were able to use that to evaluate the narratives coming from the field. And then to understand the narratives that were coming out of, and then from that group, the groups that we found were doing really great storytelling related to like collective action and narrative and economic justice and building power. We interviewed representatives from there to unearth like, how do we tell better stories? So that's an example of like a creative way to like, just how are you going to get some information and data and use it to make sense and make meaning? Okay, next question. How can you measure ripple effects of your organization's narrative change work in pop culture, media, or the broader movement, beyond measuring direct impact through social analytics, media hits, and campaigns? Who wants to jump in?
One of the things is really kind of doing a case study and focusing on who are the organizations that you're interacting with, tracking kind of relationships are really important. Maintaining relationships with the folks that have participated, and kind of you can check in with them over time, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year down the line. Are they still engaging with the work? Are they still communicating with you? And see how your organization's name is coming up and the resources and who else is referencing them. So whether that's keeping track of it online, or if you're familiar with who's having webinars, are they mentioning your resource? All of that is one way of seeing that if it's continuing to resonate.
One other thing I would add is you can track, especially if you're working on a campaign to change narratives or seed new terminology or ways of speaking about an issue, is track kind of social media or other news articles, things like that, and see where that language has been changed. So this isn't social media posts that you're putting out, but other aspects of the media in the future. And one example of this that I saw in 2020, there was a movement in the New York City theater community. We see white American theater where folks of color, theater practitioners of color, were putting forth a manifesto to call out racism in the theater industry. And one very interesting outcropping that I saw just doing an informal analysis, the next year, so many theaters in New York City did shows about Black women and basketball. And it was just a very subtle kind of uptake piece beyond any formal analysis of staffing changes, rule changes, things like that. You could just see in the shape of the shows that were being put on their responses to that movement.
Emily, since you mentioned sort of that listening piece there, just thinking about sort of some of the tools that I saw the platform shared in the chat, Brand Watch, Meltwater, Hootsuite, Talkwalker, Sprout Social. These are, user-friendly tools that you can use to set up sort of alerts and monitor any sort of shifts in language. I think there are audience insights features on, Instagram that you can track sort of the analytics from like who is saying these things, what kind of engagement patterns are there. Google Analytics, also can produce reports in that same way. Metapixel. There's just all these sort of different integration systems that can help you think through how to listen, where to listen, and who is saying something about what you're interested in changing or shifting.
Great. And just to plug a resource, Brett Davidson has written a really great piece. I see him in the chat on measuring narratives and ripple effect mapping or ripple effects. And then there's also a really great methodology called ripple effect mapping. And it's linked in our resources, which we will share with you all. And it's essentially like you bring together all the stakeholders who were engaged in the event or may have been somehow seen the narrative or exposed to the narrative or would have been the people who would have been changed or have seen the change happen. And you have them start to talk about the outcomes that happened and sort of reverse engineer what has happened over time because of a particular event. And it's a really efficient and affordable way to do some sort of backwards looking impact work. So I recommend looking at that resource too if you're looking for something like that. All right, let's go to our next question. I'm going to skip for the group to number 4 because we kind of already talked about 3. How does someone track narrative change in society at large around a certain topic? For us, mass incarceration and justice reform.
That's kind of a big one. It seems like you would want to start with some more of the policy piece to see what sort of changes are or shifts are taking place within that space. I know I've seen some recent studies that, of course, I can't remember at this time, just that talk about sort of the impact and influence of creative entertainment media on how we think about and connect with people who have a carceral past. And so you could sort of build your intended shift around distancing yourself from that type of content in a way that humanizes people who have had carceral experiences, calling out policies or programs or systems that benefit off of extracted labor from those who are incarcerated, as well as anyone that is continuing to be punished with a scarlet letter of policies that impact people that are formerly incarcerated, with housing and with finding jobs. And so you have a couple of options. So just, I guess it depends on what you would want to pinpoint and like where you would be tracking that change.
Great. And then Melody, why don't you wrap us up with your thought? Because I know you have a reflection on this, and then we'll wrap up the session because we're at time.
Wow. I mean, look, this is one of those things that kind of relying on our peers and our colleagues who are doing similar work in certain issue areas, whether it's Centers for Scholars and Storytellers on youth, whether it's Harmony Labs doing different things. And that's why I'm really excited that there's so many other folks that are looking at kind of the big picture narrative shifts and are willing to share that information. And the more we're able to share what we've learned, what we've done, Kate Davies kind of talks about, opening up our data to one another. I think that's really helpful, and we can kind of continue to share those resources.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. This is just the beginning of this conversation. We'll share the resources on the listserv, and then maybe that can be the beginning of the conversation. And we're all always available to answer questions, and we'll be sure to find a way to continue to be a support to you all as you explore measuring narrative change. And thank you, RadComs, for hosting this conversation.